They judged Martha for her size before they ever tasted her soul, until a lonely stranger called it home. Martha's tired, heavy hands worked the sourdough with a grace no one in this mining town expected. Flour dusted her braids, hiding the exhaustion in her eyes. "We'll finally buy that warm wool, won't we, Mama?" Lily asked. Martha pressed her aching fingers into the dough, her own stomach growling in the silence. "We'll do our best, little one." But the door swung open without a knock. Mrs. Sterling stood there, her cold eyes already counting their final days. The sun hung low and pale over the Colorado mining town, casting long, jagged shadows across the dusty square. It was the harvest fair. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, pine smoke, and the heavy, metallic tang of the mines. Martha adjusted the thin linen cloth over her sourdough loaves. They were golden, crusted with the labor of 3 days of fermentation, their tang filling the small space around her stall. Beside her, Lily stood on a wooden crate. She was small, her movements quick like a sparrow's. She straightened a row of buns with fierce, trembling concentration. "They look like gold, Mama," Lily whispered. Martha smiled, though the weight of her own body felt like a stone. She reached out, her flour-dusted hand resting briefly on Lily's shoulder. "People will see that, sweetheart. They'll taste the heart we put into them." Martha smoothed her apron, trying to hide the way it strained against her frame. She knew what they saw. In a town where men broke their backs for a handful of ore, her size was a silent accusation. They saw her as a consumer of resources, a woman who took up too much space in a world of scarcity. They didn't see the nights she spent drinking only water so Lily could have the last heel of the loaf. A shadow fell over the table. It was sharp and cold. Mrs. Sterling stood there. She was a woman of bone and lace, smelling of expensive lavender and iron-fisted morality. She didn't look at the bread. She surveyed Martha's stall with counting eyes, the borrowed baskets, the patched cloth, the way Martha's chair groaned under her weight. "Mrs. Gable," she said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a summons. Martha's hands stilled on the dough. Beside her, Lily went quiet. The girl's small hand found the hem of Martha's skirt. "The parish has been discussing your situation," Mrs. Sterling continued. Her voice carried no emotion, as flat as the winter plains. "The cellar you inhabit is no place for a child, especially not when the mother seems unable to manage her own appetites." Martha's throat tightened. "Lily is healthy, Mrs. Sterling. I work, I bake, I provide. You occupy space that others could use more efficiently, Martha. And look at you. You are a woman of excess in a season of want. It raises questions about your fitness as a guardian." Mrs. Sterling leaned in, her eyes like flint. "If you cannot pay the back rent to the parish by sunset tomorrow, I will be making other arrangements for the girl. A proper school, one where she won't be overshadowed by this." Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'll have the money. Tomorrow's market will be better." "We shall see," Mrs. Sterling replied. The words hung sharp and final. She turned on her heel, her silk skirts hissing against the dirt. Lily's voice came small and scared. "Mama? What did she mean? Is she going to take me?" Martha knelt, her knees popping with the effort. She cupped Lily's face, her thumbs brushing away a stray bit of flour. "No one is taking you. We're going to sell every loaf, every bun. We'll have enough, I promise." Lily nodded, but her eyes held a doubt too heavy for an 8-year-old. Martha turned back to the table, her hands trembling as she rearranged the bread, trying to shape hope from nothing. The fair hummed around them. Miners with soot-stained faces passed by. Women in fine wool coats paused, their eyes catching on the beautiful fermented crust of Martha's sourdough. Interest flickered. Then their gaze traveled to Martha. The interest died. They moved on. Fresh sourdough! Taste the hearth! Lily's voice rang out, bright and desperate. A woman in a velvet cloak stopped. She smelled the bread, a soft smile beginning to form. But then she looked at Martha's labored breathing, the way her body overflowed the small stool. The woman's mouth pursed in a line of judgment. She pulled her skirts back as if poverty, or Martha, was a disease she might catch. She moved to the next stall and bought a dry, flavorless bun from a woman who was thin and proper. It is a strange and bitter thing, this conditional compassion. Why do we turn away from the neighbor at our doorstep while we claim to love the world? It is the paradox of fear. When the people of this town look at Martha, they don't see a woman struggling to survive. They see a mirror of their own potential failure. They see the thin line between a full pantry and a cold cellar, and it terrifies them. By judging her, they convince themselves they are different. They tell themselves that if they are thin, if they are fit, if they follow the rules of the parish, they can never fall that low. They X-ray her life for an excuse to be cruel, and they find it in her weight. They push her away to prove to themselves that they belong to the worthy few. It isn't her size they hate. It's the reminder that life is fragile and grace is rare. "Mama, why won't they try?" Lily's voice was growing hoarse. "Your bread is the best in the territory." Martha's throat closed. "Because some people judge the book by its cover before they ever read the story, sweetheart. Keep calling. Someone will hear." Across the square, Silas Vance loaded supplies into his wagon. He watched the small girl working the crowd with heartbreaking determination. He watched the mother, standing tall, despite the weight of 1,000 stairs. Something in their persistence pulled at him. He adjusted his hat, his eyes narrowing against the pale sun. The market was closing. The shadows were growing longer. And for Martha, every passing second felt like the closing of a door. The shadows were stretching across the dusty square as Silas Vance made his way to his wagon. He walked with a heavy, rhythmic thud, his eyes fixed on the horizon, ignoring the chatter of the fair. To Silas, the world was a series of tasks to be completed, a burden to be carried until the sun went down. He had buried his wife and his joy in the same frozen ground 3 winters ago, and since then his ranch had become a fortress of silence. "Sir!" "Wait!" The sound of a brass whistle cut through the air, sharp and insistent. It was a sound Silas hadn't heard in years, the old signal miners used when they found a vein of gold. He stopped, his shoulders tensing. He turned his head slowly, his face as unreadable as a mountain cliff. Lily stood by her mother's stall, the copper whistle still gripped in her hand. Beside her, Martha stood tall, though the exhaustion was etched into every line of her face. "You haven't tried the hearth bread, sir," the girl said, her chest heaving. "My mama made it. It's the only one left." Silas looked at the woman. He saw the way the townspeople skirted around her stall, the way they looked at her size with a mixture of pity and disgust. He saw the flour on her braids and the quiet, steady strength in her eyes. He stepped closer, the dirt crunching beneath his boots. Martha didn't offer a sales pitch. She simply sliced a piece of the sourdough, the crust crackling like dry leaves under the knife. She handed it to him on a scrap of linen. "It's the slow rise, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice low and melodic. "It takes time to find its heart." Silas took the bread. His fingers were calloused and cold. Hers were warm and dusted with white powder. He bit into it. The crunch was the first thing, a deep, resonant sound that felt like home. Then came the tang of the starter, a complex, living flavor that danced on his tongue. In the world of science, they call this the Proustian effect. It's a remarkable quirk of the human brain. Most of our senses have to be processed by our logic centers first. But our sense of taste and smell is wired directly into the limbic system, the seat of our emotions and memories. It is a biological time machine. For Silas, the logic of the dusty market vanished. The electrical signals from that single bite bypassed his grief and struck a chord he thought had snapped years ago. Suddenly, he wasn't standing in a mining town. He was 6 years old, sitting on a sun-drenched porch. He could smell the wild sage on the wind and hear his mother's apron snapping in the breeze as she pulled a fresh loaf from the oven. The sourdough wasn't just food. It was a sensory map back to a version of himself that was still whole. It was the taste of safety. The taste of being wanted. He opened his eyes, and for a moment the iron mask he wore slipped. He looked at the bread, then at Martha. He saw the flour on the tip of her nose and the way she held her breath, waiting for a judgment she had grown all too used to receiving. "It tastes like home," Silas said. His voice was gravelly, a sound like stones grinding together. Martha's eyes widened. She had expected a "thank you" or a "not bad," but not this. "The men in town, they say it's too sour, too heavy." "The men in town don't know the difference between a meal and fuel," Silas replied. He reached for his purse, the leather creaking. He set a heavy gold coin on the table, far more than the bread was worth. "I have a ranch 3 miles north. The kitchen is cold. The men are eating hardtack and beans, and I've forgotten what a Sunday morning feels like. I need a cook who understands that bread is more than just flour and water." Lily gasped, her small hands flying to her mouth. "A ranch, Mama? With real horses?" Silas looked at the girl, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And a kitchen bigger than this stall. You can stay in the guest cabin. It's solid wood, with a stove that actually holds the heat." Martha looked at the coin, then at the sharp, judgmental face of Mrs. Sterling across the square. She knew that leaving with a single rancher would set the tongues wagging. She knew the moral women of the parish would call it a scandal. But she looked at Lily's hollow cheeks and the empty tins on her table. "We have rules here, Mr. Vance," Martha said, her jaw tightening. "The parish says—" "The parish isn't the one eating your bread, Mrs. Gable," Silas cut her off. "I am, and I say your value isn't something they get to decide. Pack your things. I'll bring the wagon around by sunset." As he walked away, Martha felt a strange sensation in her chest. It was a lightness she hadn't felt since her husband died. She looked at her hands, the hands the town called excessive, and realized they were the very things that had just built a bridge to a new life. Silas Vance was a stoic man, but as he climbed onto his wagon, the silence of the ranch no longer seemed quite so loud. The harvest fair was still buzzing, but the mirror of failure the town had tried to hold up to Martha had finally shattered. She wasn't just a widow in a cellar anymore. She was the woman who had brought the taste of home back to a man who had lost his way. The sun didn't set that evening. It simply surrendered to a gray, suffocating cold that crawled over the Colorado peaks and settled into the bones of the town. Martha didn't look back as she pulled the handcart. It held their entire world: 2 moth-eaten blankets, a single iron pot, and the glass jar of sourdough starter she held against her chest like a living heart. The parish cellar had been a hole, but it had a door. The grain cellar at the edge of the mining camp had only a sagging timber and the smell of ancient, rotting dust. The wind bit through the cracks in the stone walls. Martha watched the frost bloom like white, jagged flowers on the floor. Lily sat on the blankets, her breath puffing out in small, ghost-like clouds. She didn't complain. She just watched her mother. Martha was on her knees, trying to coax a flame from a handful of damp wood and dry grass. Her movements were slow, her frame casting a massive, trembling shadow against the damp walls. The timber shifted. The heavy scent of lavender and iron-fisted judgment announced her before she even spoke. Mrs. Sterling stood at the top of the stone steps, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. She didn't come down. She stayed in the clean air, looking down into the pit as if she were inspecting a trap for vermin. A fitting place for a woman of such unrefined habits, Mrs. Sterling said. Her voice was thin, sharp as a razor. I told you the parish had rules, Martha. You chose to ignore them for the sake of a rancher's gold coin. A coin that, I see, has already vanished. Martha didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the struggling spark. The gold went to the back rent I owed you, Mrs. Sterling. You have your money. Leave us our peace. Mrs. Sterling's gaze fell on the glass jar sitting near the fire. The starter was bubbling, a pale, living thing in the darkness. You still cling to this sour, fermented rot? You think this is your way out? You think a few loaves of bread will make you more than what you are? She stepped down one rung. You are an obese widow, Martha. You are a burden on the morality of this town. And the girl, she deserves to be raised by those who understand the value of a thin, disciplined life, not by someone who feeds her dreams on yeast and shadows. With a sudden, violent movement, Mrs. Sterling reached out with the tip of her leather boot. She didn't just kick the jar, she crushed it against the stone wall. The glass shattered. The pale, fermented dough spilled into the dirt and soot, mixing with the filth of the cellar floor. Martha's breath hitched. That starter had been alive for 3 generations. It was her grandmother's kitchen in Virginia. It was the smell of her husband's Saturday mornings. It was her only hope of proving to Silas Vance that she was worth the wage he promised. Now, Mrs. Sterling whispered, her eyes glittering. There is nothing left to ferment, Martha. By morning you will realize that you have nothing, and I will take the child. She left. The heavy timber thudded back into place, plunging the cellar into a darkness so thick it felt like water. Willie began to cry, a soft, hitching sound that tore through the silence. Martha didn't move for a long time. She stared at the pale smear of dough in the dirt. Her hope was a puddle of gray sludge. She felt the abyss opening up beneath her, the crushing weight of her own body, her own failures, her own grief. But then, she felt a small hand on her arm. In the dim, dying light of the embers, Martha reached out. She sat on the damp floor, her hands raw and red. These were the echoes from her cracked hands, the hands the town only saw as oversized and clumsy. They were hands that had scrubbed the grit from the mine owners' porches until the skin peeled away. They were hands that had carried Lily through a fever for 3 days without sleep. She hid them behind her back when Lily looked. She didn't want the child to see the blood seeping from the cracks in her knuckles. "Mama, your hands, they're hurting," Lily whispered, her voice a small, heartbreaking sound. Martha pulled her daughter close. She reached into her pocket and found a scrap of the red ribbon Ruby had once mentioned. No, it was a piece of the wool she had been janting. She smoothed it out with her rough fingers. "The pain is just a visitor, Lily," Martha said. Her voice was steady, a low rumble that vibrated against the girl's chest. "It doesn't live here. It's just passing through. But our honor, that stays. Our love, that's the hearth that never goes out." She took Lily's small, cold hands into her own. "She took the jar, sweetheart, but she didn't take the knowledge. She didn't take the memory. As long as I have these hands, I can build a home from the dust. We aren't defeated. We're just waiting for the sun." The night grew colder. The cellar smelled of mildew and old candles. Martha lay awake, her body a shield between her daughter and the freezing draft. She ran her calculations again and again, her mind working through the impossible debt of the world. She had no flour, no yeast, no jar. But as the first light of dawn touched the top of the cellar steps, Martha Gable didn't look like a woman who had lost everything. She looked like a woman who was finally done asking for permission to exist. She watched the shadows move across the stone, waiting for the hoofbeats she knew would come. because she knew that some fires, once lit, can never be extinguished by salt or stone. The timber above the cellar groaned. A shaft of freezing dawn light sliced through the dust. Silas Vance didn't climb down. He leapt, his boots hitting the dirt floor with a heavy, final thud. He didn't look at the shattered glass on the floor or the gray sludge of the ruined sourdough. He looked at Martha, who was huddled over Lily, her massive frame trembling with the effort of being a shield against the cold. "I told you I'd be back by sunset," Silas said. His voice was like a low roll of thunder in the small space. "The wagon got stuck in the drifts. I'm late." Martha looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "It's over, Silas. Mrs. Sterling, she broke the jar. My men is gone. I have nothing to bake with. I have nothing to give you." Silas reached into the pocket of his heavy wool coat. He pulled out a ceramic jar, wrapped in a piece of aged, yellowed lace. He knelt in the dirt, his knees level with hers. He held it out. It was a weight, a promise. "This was my mother's," Silas whispered. "She carried it across the plains in a covered wagon. She fed my father and me for 20 years with what's inside. I haven't opened it since the day we buried her. I was afraid to. Afraid the life in it had died, just like everything else in that house." He pressed the jar into Martha's flour-stained hands. "But you brought the scent of the hearth back to my halls. You take it. Keep it alive." The town square was already alive with the cruel energy of a crowd waiting for a fall. Mrs. Sterling stood on the steps of the parish, a group of women in dark skirts gathered behind her like a flock of crows. When Silas's wagon rattled into the square, the silence that fell was sharp and jagged. Silas didn't stop at the edge. He drove the horses right to the steps. He leapt down and helped Martha descend. She stood tall, her heavy wool shawl wrapped around her, her chin high. Lily clung to her skirt, her eyes wide but no longer wet. "Mr. Vance," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "This is highly improper. You are harboring a woman who has no means, no prospect, and a child who needs a disciplined upbringing. Think of your reputation." Silas stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, but it cut through the wind like a blade. "I've heard enough of your discipline, Mrs. Sterling. I've seen your charity. It looks a lot like a grave." He turned to the crowd, his eyes scanning the pinched faces and satisfied smiles. "You all talk of virtue in the pews on Sunday, but you practice cruelty in the streets on Monday. You worry about the propriety of my house, but you're perfectly comfortable watching a child freeze in a grain cellar because her mother doesn't fit your mold of a worthy woman." He looked back at Mrs. Sterling. "You aren't trying to help. You're trying to control. You use your rules as a cage because you're terrified of a heart that's bigger than your own. You look at Martha and you see excess. I look at her and I see the only person in this town with enough soul to feed the hungry." Silas turned to Martha. The square went quiet, so quiet you could hear the snap of the frozen banners in the wind. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't hide the moment. He took Martha's hands, the hands the town called excessive, and held them firmly in his own. "Martha Gable," Silas said, "I didn't come here looking for a servant. My house has been empty for a long time. Not just quiet, but empty of life. I'd built walls so high I thought I was safe. But you didn't even try to push them down. You just showed up with the taste of home, and you climbed right over them." He knelt in the dirt. One knee down. "I know how this looks to them. Let them talk. I don't care about their propriety. I care about the warmth in my kitchen and the laughter in my hallways. I'm asking you to be my wife. Not because I'm rescuing you, but because I finally realized I'm the one who's been lost." Martha's breath caught. A sob escaped her, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief that seemed to echo off the stone buildings. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, so the crows on the steps could hear, "Yes, Silas." Lily shrieked with delight. Silas stood and pulled Martha into his arms, solid and warm and real. The sound that rose from the crowd was a mixture of shock and a few quiet, shamed whispers of approval. Mrs. Sterling stayed on the steps, her mouth a thin line of defeat. But for the first time in a year, Martha didn't feel the weight of those eyes. She only felt the sun. The wagon road to the Vance ranch didn't lead to a palace, but as the wheels crunched over the frost-covered gravel, Martha felt like she was entering a sanctuary. The guest cabin was small, built of solid pine and cedar, but it had a heavy oak door that actually locked. For the first time in years, Martha turned a key and felt safe. Inside, Lily didn't have to huddle on a damp floor. She had a real bed with wool blankets that smelled of mountain air and sunlight. The main house was where Martha's true kingdom lay. The kitchen was a world of abundance Martha had only seen in her dreams. The stove was a massive iron beast, a black-bellied monster that looked like it could feed an entire army. Silas had stocked the pantry as if he were preparing for a siege. There were heavy sacks of fine white flour, jars of coarse salt, barrels of dark molasses, and crates of smoked hams. Abundance. It was a word Martha had forgotten how to speak. At first, the ranch hands were wary. These were men carved from granite and grit, men who spent their days roping steers and mending fences under a brutal sun. They were used to hardtack, dried beans, and the bitter, thin coffee Silas brewed. When they first saw Martha, they didn't see a woman. They saw the obese widow the town whispered about. They saw her size, the way she moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, her heavy indigo shadow filling the kitchen doorway. They expected her to be a burden, but then they smelled the sourdough. Martha didn't just cook, she curated a language of comfort. She took the aged starter Silas had entrusted to her, the one that had crossed the plains in his mother's lap, and she nursed it back to life. Every morning at 4, the scent of fermenting dough and sizzling bacon drifted across the yard and into the bunkhouse. The men began arriving for breakfast 20 minutes early. They didn't just eat. They sat in a heavy, reverent silence, savoring the complex tang of the bread as if it were a long-lost memory. "Best thing I've tasted since I left Kentucky," one of the hands, a man with a scar across his cheek and eyes like flint, said after the first week. He tipped his hat to her as he left. He didn't look at her weight. He looked at the strength in her flour-stained hands. Martha realized something profound as the winter began to thaw into spring. Her body hadn't changed. She was still the same woman the Parish had judged. She still occupied more space than the proper women in their tight corsets. But the eyes of the world had shifted, because she no longer stood in the position of a beggar. When she rode the wagon into town now to buy supplies, she didn't duck her head. She stood tall on the seat, her indigo wool dress bright against the dust. The townspeople still whispered, but the whispers had lost their teeth. They didn't see a burden anymore. They saw the woman who held the keys to the most prosperous ranch in the Colorado Territory. They saw the woman Silas Vance looked at with a quiet, unwavering respect. Martha realized that her size wasn't her weakness. It was the physical manifestation of the space she was finally allowed to take up. She had built a Phao Dai Tâm, a fortress of the soul, and Din Kien was no longer allowed inside the gates. Lily changed the most. The copper whistle, once her only way to cry for help, now sat on a high shelf in the cabin, gathering dust. She didn't need to signal for rescue anymore. She carried a slate and a satchel of books. Every morning, Silas would lift her onto the gentlest mare and lead her to the schoolhouse. Lily didn't look back with fear. She looked forward with the bright, fierce eyes of a girl who knew she had a home. "Mama, look," Lily said one evening, showing her a drawing of the ranch. I didn't draw the fences, just the hearth. Martha looked at Silas, who was sitting by the fire, mending a leather bridle. He looked up, his stoic face softening in the amber glow. The hearth is the only part that matters, Silas said quietly. Martha reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were thinned by work, but strengthened by purpose. She had spent a lifetime trying to shrink herself to fit into the narrow boxes the world had built for her. Now she realized the frontier was big enough for all of her. The house was no longer just a building of wood and stone. It was a faudai, a fortress built one loaf of bread, one kindness, and one choice at a time. And this time, the walls were made of something no scandal could ever tear down. The snow fell in soft, steady sheets, blanketing the Colorado Territory in a silence that felt like a prayer. It was harvest fair again. 1 year since Martha had stood in the dust of the square, her heart heavy with the weight of a town's judgment. But this year, the road to the Vance ranch was lined with lanterns. The main house overflowed with light and the deep, resonant scent of fermenting dough and roasted meat. This wasn't just a dinner for ranch hands. Martha had opened the gates to the people the town preferred to forget. The blacksmith who had lost his sight in a forge accident, the elderly widow from the edge of the mining camp, the orphans who usually spent the fair scavenging for scraps behind the velvet-draped stalls. Martha moved among them, her presence a source of warmth that seemed to push back the winter chill. She wasn't just the obese widow anymore. She was the architect of a new kind of community. The sound of a rattling buggy drifted from the gate. Martha looked through the frosted window. Mrs. Sterling sat in her carriage, her frame looking smaller, more brittle against the vast, dark sky. She hadn't come to join the feast. She was simply passing through, her silhouette a portrait of a lonely, rigid life. Martha picked up a loaf of sourdough, still steaming from the oven. She wrapped it in a clean white linen and stepped out into the cold. Silas watched her from the porch, his hand resting on the railing. He didn't stop her. He knew that some debts aren't paid in coin, but in a grace that the world doesn't understand. Martha reached the buggy. Mrs. Sterling's hands tightened on the reins, her mouth setting into that familiar thin line. She looked at Martha, then at the ranch house, her eyes reflecting the glow of a hearth she would never sit beside. "It's harvest, Mrs. Sterling," Martha said. Her voice was steady, devoid of the bitterness that had once tasted like ash in her mouth. She held out the bread. "No one should have to eat alone tonight, not even those who think they don't need anyone." Mrs. Sterling looked at the bread, then at Martha's hands. For a long second, the only sound was the wind. Then the older woman reached out. Her fingers were trembling. She took the loaf, the warmth of it seeping through her gloves. She didn't say thank you. She couldn't. But as she pulled the carriage away, the way her shoulders slumped suggested that the cage of her own making had finally begun to crack. Martha walked back to the house, the snow crunching beneath her boots. She realized then that forgiveness isn't about the person who hurt you. It's a gift you give yourself. It's the choice to stop being a prisoner of someone else's cruelty. By giving that bread, Martha hadn't just fed a hungry woman. She had finally set herself free. Inside, the ranch house hummed with the sound of laughter and the clatter of plates. Silas found her in the kitchen. He took a piece of the bread, tasted it, and closed his eyes. "It tastes like home, Martha," he said quietly. Lily passed by, her arms full of plates, her face glowing. "He always says that, Mama." "I know," Martha replied, touching Silas's face. "And for the first time in my life, I finally believe him." Home isn't a place you find. It isn't a room the parish can take away or a cellar where the world tries to hide you. Martha Gable had learned that home is something you build. One loaf, one choice, and one act of courage at a time. It is the Phao Dai Tam Hon, the fortress of the soul, where the only rules that matter are the ones written in kindness. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But the house on the hill stayed warm, because when you build a hearth out of love, the fire never truly goes out. If you've ever felt like the world was trying to shrink you, remember Martha. Your value isn't something others get to decide. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to be heard, and you are allowed to build your own version of home, no matter what the whispers say. Would you like to see how Martha's story continues in the next season, or shall we explore the secrets of another soul who found their way back to the light?